still have some more people coming in, which is great. It's towards the end of the day, all right? It's about, well, halfway through, I guess. But hopefully you've had a great session. My name's Keith Stryer. Really glad that you came today. We've got an amazing panel. This is the kind of panel where you normally want 90 minutes, but we have 30. So we're going to have to just hightail it. The panel is called Critical Technologies, Reshaping National Priorities. This is an investor conference largely, so the question on your mind might be why we're going to talk about public policy and government and that kind of thing. But we're going to answer that question. So we'll come to that. It's actually a very, very relevant topic for today, no matter what sector you're in, but particularly if you're in the tech sector. So why don't we just go through the panelists? I'll quickly introduce them, and then I'm going to let them also talk individually. Martin here is a pioneer in the area of tech diplomacy. He was Austria's first technology ambassador, stationed here in the U.S., but with global responsibility on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, correct? And is doing just bringing a lot of leadership to that space, and we'll talk about that. And a career diplomat, I believe, correct? Will is here on behalf of the UK government, stationed in San Francisco. He's the head of tech policy and the deputy tech envoy to the US, and also a distinguished career in government, I believe, Will. So thank you very much. And Nilu is as a very, very accomplished industry executive. And as you mentioned, you've made almost every one of the 20 years, correct, of this event, which is incredible. And has real depth in cybersecurity and national security and cyber affairs, and will bring that dimension for us to the conversation. So on my job at NVIDIA, I'm the global head of public sector, so I am the interface to all foreign governments, both in terms of strategic and commercial relationships with governments. And that gives me kind of a unique perspective because of our role in the global AI landscape as this company that brings this end-to-end sort of full-stack computing platform that underpins the modern era of AI. As you can imagine, this has gone from an interesting academic sort of field and around scientific computing and that kind of thing to a central lever for governments in terms of driving growth, innovation, resilience, and security for countries. So the supercomputers and the AI that the workloads that run on top of them are now really central to national policy, and we'll talk about that. But this session is really important because if you were just in enterprise IT, right? If you work for SAP or Workday or ServiceNow, all great companies doing great things for our economy, then you probably, you might have had a small government affairs group, and maybe there's some regulations you cared about, but for the most part, you were focused on your market, serving your customers, innovating, and driving value to your shareholders. As we come into this new era of critical technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing and all forms of computing, the regulations and the opportunity in government and the importance of policy to your business, it's at a whole nother level. This is a different chapter, right? There's a convergence of both government needing to focus on AI and AI being an opportunity for government. There's kind of a bilateral conversation there. So, and then it plays out in many, many other ways. So why don't I go around the room a little bit and ask you, Will, give Martin, give your perspective as one of our stars.
Well, thank you so much. I think the real key concept, and I've been really dealing with diplomacy for the last 5 to 6 years, more or less stumbled into this emerging field of tech diplomacy. I was, as you said, appointed first Austrian tech ambassador to Silicon Valley, and the responsibility there was to shape our own policies towards the very diverse tech sector there. And what we really discovered was that we actually had something of a counterpart there, and reciprocity is one of the main principles of diplomacy, that not only needed contact with the government because it concerned the business model of the company, but because also companies were increasingly realizing that their products and services were an important factor in the international landscape, whether it was geopolitical, whether it was concerning cybersecurity, or whether it was concerning human rights. And this is why dialogue was in the interests of both sides. Of course, there were a lot of challenges when it comes to this relationship between national governments and private sector companies in these critical technologies. One of them being that governments need to catch up and still need to catch up, need to understand those technologies well. And the mindsets need to change on both sides in order to manage this relationship well.
That's great. And just to clarify, to tease out one point, as what you're talking about, you know, in this era of technology, and I guess you can go back about 20 years now, it's not just today, but since sort of the internet and then into mobile phones and now into AI, the big tech companies now have a standing that almost equivalent geopolitically to nation states. Right, and if you're whether you're a large or small country, it's potentially those companies and their products can have an impact on your population in a way that would again require the appointment of an ambassador to engage with them on that level.
Yeah, absolutely. If you just look at the GDP of one of those big tech companies, these global platforms, it supersedes sometimes the GDP of the annual revenues, supersedes the GDP of a small or even medium-sized company. So I think there's an increasing interest, and then of course these small and medium-sized countries realize that and are ramping up their own capabilities and capacities in order to deal with this new situation.
And for a little history, the first tech ambassador was appointed in
2017 by Denmark.
By Denmark.
In the meantime, the European Union has an office since last fall.
Ambassador de Graaf.
Ambassador de Graaf, really talking about this massive legislative effort coming out of Brussels. And we just founded 2 weeks ago, together with the World Economic Forum in San Francisco, a tech diplomacy network, which is really open to all countries.
Yes.
And we've been really overwhelmed with this interest by both private companies as well as countries that want to work with us in order to develop this kind of new relationship.
Yeah. And also, on one final note, the U.S. has just appointed its first technology ambassador, Ambassador Nate Fick, obviously reporting to Secretary Blinken. And so we've entered that age, and the State Department has set up a Bureau of Cyber Affairs, and so now we can participate, you know, on that level, which is great. Well, on behalf of the UK, you know, could you share your perspectives?
Yeah, sure. So I'm another tech diplomat. I'd say slightly more deliberate than the way Martin was describing it. The UK appointed its first tech envoy in 2020, and I took the opportunity to come out here and work alongside him. And I head up our tech policy work, which is everything from how we regulate or plan to regulate tech platforms and tech companies, but also how the UK thinks about preparing for the technologies of the future and what our role is as a leading science and tech superpower. And this all came out of a very strategic, deep review that the UK conducted around 2020, 2021, in the midst of the pandemic. It was called the Integrated Review, and it was a review of our foreign policy, our defense policy, our national security interest, as well as economic prosperity. And it really identified critical and emerging technologies as the driving force for our future prosperity and the thing that will define power relations through the 21st century. So, you know, one aspect of that was appointing a tech envoy. Other aspects of it we can come to talk to later, and I've got loads of new announcements that came out earlier this week. But, you know, just reflecting on the last couple of years, we've seen not just during the pandemic, where, you know, the role of tech companies and the role of technology in helping us navigate through the pandemic, developing vaccines so that we could come back to work, etc. I'm sure we'll talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the role of tech companies.
I like that you point to me
I
as the embodiment
our national
of
security
Ukraine
as a
conflict.
guest.
Speaker.
And then we've also seen, you know, just in the last few months, we've seen advancements right here in California in like nuclear fusion, where the Lawrence Livermore lab, they, you know, demonstrated you can get more energy out of a nuclear fusion reaction than you put in. Google announced a sort of breakthrough in quantum computing with their error correction milestone that they achieved. We've seen generative AI, and, you know, I'm not a betting man, but I'm pretty sure, you know, AGI will be developed in some lab in some corner of, you know, Silicon Valley at some point in the next 20 to 50 years. And all of these trends like really kind of relate back to what the UK government's doing. And so earlier this week, the Prime Minister of the UK, Rishi Sunak, who actually studied at Stanford and really gets technology. He's created a new platform within government, the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, which will lead all the way through from R&D into critical technology through to the policy making and the rules and the governance of it. And so we've set out the UK Science and Tech Framework, which is really there to kind of be the driving agenda for the next decade on how the UK can cement its position in science and tech. You know, we have 4 of the world's top 10 universities. We have a tech sector worth over $1 trillion. We've got lots and lots of strengths, but we need to keep going further. This needs to be a whole of government, a whole of society effort. So it's all about how we attract talent from overseas, how we develop talent domestically, how we partner with academia and the private sector, and also critically how we partner with international organizations and other countries, through G7, through G20, and then bilaterally. So it's, we can dive into all sorts of those areas, but that's some of the stuff the UK is doing, and it really is around specific critical emerging technologies, quantum, AI, semiconductors, engineering, biology. Those are 4 of the areas where the UK has got strengths. We need to work with partners to own, collaborate, and develop those technologies so that we can have a seat at the table through the 21st century.
Yeah, and your Prime Minister announced on Monday, as you mentioned, there's a series of announcements, and one of them, I think, it might have been last night actually, and hit the press today, but that the UK wants to spend almost $1 billion on supercomputers, as part of sort of its overall investment, as one down payment on a much bigger technology strategy.
Yeah, and it's all part of I didn't mention the digital, physical and digital infrastructure that we need to underpin these technologies and develop them. So thank you for.
But understanding the room has a lot of investors, right, and entrepreneurs, right? Yeah. From that perspective, you want them also to know that the UK is a great place to do work. Yep. A great place to innovate.
And that there'll be more news on semiconductors, on quantum, on all these areas in the coming weeks and months. Great. Watch this space.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. Well, now that before we get to Ukraine, let's talk more broadly about some of your experience and perspectives.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to thank the folks at Marsh for letting me come back for 20 years. Not many institutions let me do that, so it's fantastic to be here. I also want to point out that our first U.S. Cyber and Tech Ambassador is actually in the audience. So not to raise the bar for anyone here, but he's judging us, so we need to be on our A game. So I live at the intersection of national security and technology, both in the private and public sector. I sit on 11 boards. A few are government boards, and I advise the Department of Defense, intelligence community. I sit on private sector, both public and private companies, and I work with think tanks and human rights organizations. And I think we're in a really interesting moment in times, just from a humanity perspective. So as humanity, we're used to having time to adapt to tech revolutions, right? We had 200 years to adapt to the printing press. We had 200 years to adapt to the agricultural revolution. We had 100 years to adapt to the industrial revolution. We had 40 years to adapt to the IT revolution. Arguably, and you're kind of mentioning it, we have multiple revolutions going on right now. So whether it's AI, quantum, synthetic biology, energy, space, semiconductor, they're happening simultaneously without a whole lot of time to adapt. Not only are those revolutions happening, but the intersection of those tech revolutions are really interesting, right? So advanced manufacturing and synthetic biology. What happens when you combine AI, edge computing, and human-machine interface, right? That's what enables surveillance states. And so our ability as governments, as policy folks, to keep pace with tech innovation is going to require us to think differently. We're going to have exponential thinking in order to be able to thrive in this era of exponential revolutions. And part of what that means is that neither the government nor the private sector is going to do it alone. Private sector is going to have increasing obligation to think about the technology use cases and to deliver norms and self-regulate in a way that the tech sector has never been able to self-regulate productively. On the flip side, industrial policy is going to play an incredibly important role and by the way, not a US-centric industrial policy, because we can't do this alone, as we're learning especially through Russia-Ukraine and as we look forward to a potential conflict with China. No country can do this alone. So how we develop industrial policy with our allies, broadly speaking, and how we enforce it and how the private sector engages in this conversation and really, again, self-regulates in a way it has never done before, is going to determine how this plays out.
Yeah, the international. So I want to start back and work my way backwards. International cooperation is so essential to what we're doing. That's why you're here. That's why you're here, right? The AI is uniquely open source in nature, right? If you look at just pick AI because we don't have time to cover all the critical technologies. But if you do look at the history of artificial intelligence, right, it's a very academic pursuit, very collaborative, very cross-border, very very common to have professors or graduate students from multiple countries, working on papers together. And it's very common for the biggest tech companies in the world, as soon as they complete a model or develop a tool or new framework, to open source it, to post it on GitHub and that kind of thing. So it has been a uniquely open, cooperative type of community. And now that's coming sort of face to face with the geopolitical reality of the technology as it's become more and more important, right?
Right, because whoever can get there first, right? The quantum advantage is real. AI advantage is real.
Yeah. And
it has implications from a geopolitical perspective. It has implications from an economic perspective.
Yeah.
And from a military perspective.
Yeah, and you mentioned, of course, we can't have this meeting and not talk about ChatGPT or generative AI, more speaking, but everyone, immediately thinks chatbots and texting and conversations, but there's many, many other applications here. And you mentioned synthetic biology. One of the most exciting things that I'm seeing from NVIDIA's perspective is the application of those large language models to biology and to, proteomics and to drug discovery. And, they're essentially inventing new molecular structures, just like they're writing paragraphs and poems, they're writing proteins. They've been trained in the language of biology. So that technology, we're just sort of unfolding its potential in so many different fields beyond writing your child's essay for college or whatever.
Right, and we can't ignore the flip side of it, which is from a misinformation, disinformation, information warfare perspective, the implications of generative AI are very problematic.
Well, I'll come back to you on that point because I was actually reading a paper recently on that very point about just the implications for international relations and strategic engagement with nations and diplomacy as a result of not just generative AI, but just AI in general, and the ability to industrialize misinformation, the ability adversarial AI, and all these new fields and domains that just weren't part of they weren't part of the playbook when you became a diplomat, right? So how are they dealing with it now?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that not only scientists and private sector companies have this collaborative spirit, but that also nation states, when they are like-minded and when they are aligned in their values, that they also understand that collaboration is the only way forward. And I think in the time that I've been posted in Silicon Valley, which was around 2016 when we opened up our own office there, until now, the spirit has completely changed. It was a very competitive, every country on its own, to now really informal and formal groups of collaborations, mainly between like-minded countries. But honestly, the higher you get, then we are all like-minded because it's about the survival of humanity. And I think when it comes to disinformation, of course, this touches the very foundations of our institutions and of democracy. And therefore, our countries that are in some ways have democratically elected governments need to enter into dialogue and are also approached very often by these companies to talk about the issues, find commonalities, and sometimes talk about unintended consequences of policy regulations. They're often well intended by governments, and then have either in our own countries or somewhere else around the globe consequences that we haven't anticipated. So these dialogues are happening in formalized and informal ways, not only in Silicon Valley, of course also in places of multilateral diplomacies where it's about standards and norms. But it's important that the countries that really care about human rights, about kind of values, and ultimately about the survival of our planet work together.
Yeah.
Can I say one controversial thing I would put out there is I was recently part of a task force at the Council on Foreign Relations where we challenged this concept of do we only set these norms with like-minded countries or not?
Yeah.
Or do we create a broader coalition acknowledging that look, each country is going to use tech for its own, to promote its own purposes, whatever they happen to be. They're not necessarily all going to be democratic. But there are certain norms that are so important that we establish that we open it up to countries that aren't in alignment with us from a values perspective and create a broader coalition. And these would be, you know, critical things like nuclear command and control is sure. Not a, you know, you should not be hacking nuclear command and control. Yeah. And so do we expand the
so I come into, I sit on a bunch of roles. I sit on some committees, chair some committees at the OECD and also on our U.S. National AI Advisory Committee, and this comes up all the time. And it's a really important conversation because we have our allies, that we have our shared values, and it's very important to promote democracy through these technology initiatives and to harmonize around the adoption of responsible AI and trustworthy AI. At the same time, we have countries with whom we have common interests, but maybe not common values, right? And those interests are important. Those interests are very strategic to the country for many reasons. And having a bigger tent and collaborating under that tent has advantages as well. Because the failure to have that big tent leads to a vacuum, and we can all postulate where that goes. So I think there are different camps on that. I tend to lean in the bigger tent camp personally, and through engagement. But you know, that it's a moving. What I will say though is, at least as it relates to Europe, both the UK and the EU and the US, I think that there is a really strong alignment and a lot of sincere effort to harmonize. We don't agree on everything. You know, there's different ways, different methods and frameworks being used, you know, for different things, but an absolute top-down, bottoms-up commitment to harmonize those so we're all going in the same direction. And I think, and it's happening fast for the reasons that you stated.
Can I just come in on that? I mean, it's an area that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, particularly on AI and this generative AI. And it comes to your point, Nilu, around, you know, the pace of change of so many different technologies. You know, you can have a discussion about, you know, who knows about these technologies. I think that the kind of set of questions picked up from the Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, but she's got this great set of questions around who knows, who decides, who decides, who decides. And it's really, really critical. And I was thinking about it in the context of generative AI, and you know, we can have all these conversations here, but actually the decision makers, you know, they're set in a really small handful of labs with a really small handful of people who really understand how these models work. They're deciding who gets access. They're deciding what they can do with them. The flip side, from a tech kind of release example, would be, you know, where you completely open source a model. And then everyone has access, and then that creates all these risks. And I really don't know what the right answer is, but at the moment, I think the pace of change is such that, you know, governments are really, and regulators are really struggling to, you know, work out what the technologies mean. You know, the process for creating legislation to govern these technologies takes a long time, as you see, you know, in all countries. And so, you know, I think it was the point you made as well, Nilu, around, you know, self-governance, self-regulation within the tech sector. You know, it's around investors thinking about the technologies and the people that they're backing and what their values are and what they're going to do with those technologies. Yeah. So I think it has to be some new form of regulation that is somewhere between, you know, what we have right now, which is a bit of a free-for-all, and, you know, government regulating, and like you said, Martin, with the risk of over-regulating or having unintended consequences from that. But at the moment, we seem to be caught between having.
Well, let's talk about let's talk about that, because, you know, let me put some numbers out there to be quantitative for a moment. So if you look at the world's biggest computers, which are important because without those you can't have things like ChatGPT. So you look at the world's biggest computers and you look at the top 500 biggest computers. There's more than that, but that happens to be the only list that's deeply curated, right? We know everything that's on that list. There are only 34 countries on that list. There are 190 countries in the UN, but only 34 have a supercomputer big enough to create a ChatGPT. Mm-hmm. So that means that 80% of the world cannot do that. So, and that's just the way it's worked out organically. Now, it's actually improved. Every year, like one more country jumps on that list, but it's still a relatively small list. And as you would expect, most of the computers on that list sit in 2 countries. right? And then there's a spattering, everyone else has 1 or 2 or 5 or whatever, right? So that is one number. The other number I'd want to throw out is 33. 33 are the number of countries that were blocked from the ChatGPT API when it was released, right? So, and that was a decision made by someone, I have no idea who or why they made that decision, but there were 33 countries not able to access. And the implication of that is a lot of countries who were not on that list still said, well, what if they did that to us down the road? And so maybe we shouldn't be dependent on a US-based API, because what if they change their mind? So the geopolitical and business market implication of that one act is that it basically told all the countries of the world, we need to do this ourselves. So what's happening now is you have pretty much most Western and most countries that I know of are either discussing or have already launched a domestic large language model initiative to build their own ChatGPT so that they are not dependent on a US company. So this is where it gets very interesting, right? It's not just a political conversation, it becomes a business conversation. And so this is, it's playing out in interesting ways, but it's not because of regulation or the absence of it, it's just the way the market's unfolding. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, when we talk about this, when you look at, for example, take Starlink, right? You have one company that made a tremendous difference to Ukraine's ability to remain successful in the war. And then at some point, Elon goes, hey, maybe I'll turn this off because I think the war should end.
That didn't go down so well.
No, it did not go down so well, but it begs the question of who holds the power? How do you control the power? How do you make sure it's not controlled in a way that excludes folks? And it goes back to a point that we were talking about earlier, which is there are real effects for getting there first on a lot and having access, right? And so there's a whole fairness doctrine that we need to also think about. Do we leave the rest of the world in the dust as we move forward? By the way, just for kicks and giggles, I did ask ChatGPT what the critical technologies are from a national priority perspective. And it spit out a list of 15 technologies that aligned almost perfectly with what the White House put out. At significantly less cost, I'm just saying.
I'll be sure to pass that along.
That's because I read that list off the internet.
It may have. I was thinking about that. It may have. It had a couple of things in it that were different and interesting.
That's funny. Of course, it would have to have been published before 2021 to show up at ChatGPT. So, and I guess, because of the nature of this conference and who's in the room, I want to always bring it back to from a business perspective, right? And the reason why this is so interesting and important, if not mission critical, is that the countries that you sell to, the customers that you can sell to, the countries from which you can source products, so it's both from a manufacturing and supply chain perspective as well as a go-to-market and growth perspective, they will all be increasingly impacted by this evolution of regulation, which remains fairly, it's not a solid yet. It's still kind of a gas or a liquid, or it hasn't achieved that state yet, right? I mean, even the AI Act in Europe is at least a year away, right? From there's a lot of activity going on, but it's not law. Right? And then of course you've got international standards which are evolving, but even within individual countries, even within cities like San Francisco and New York and London, there are rules and policies being passed that are additional layers of potential regulation. And you can argue whether that's a pro or con depending on your orientation. But are you worried about that from a business perspective?
Well, I think we have to, we talk about industrial policy, like we've had export control laws forever. The paradigm was set up a long time ago when the US used to have, and US companies had 10, 15, 20-year advantage over competitors. As we think about export controls today, for example, we have to think about it differently. If we don't let our satellite companies sell their imagery to countries, the French satellite companies are going to do it. And is that really the right way to think about it, right? How much money is Intel losing every year because it can't sell its chips to certain countries around the world? So we're going to have to rethink the approach to industrial policy and just make sure that we're balancing national security priorities with enabling our tech sector to thrive.
And profit.
Which
fuels the R&D, which goes back to our competitors.
It has to be able to do.
Yeah.
I think we also need to revise and rethink of how we do regulation. I think it's a well-known fact that once you enact regulation, it's very difficult to get rid of it and reverse it. But I think what the kind of nature of technological rapid change requires that we also redesign time limits, sunset clauses, automatic reviews of legislations, because we are realizing, even with the best minds and all the stakeholders involved in the legislative process, that just think of GDPR, and I'm now not wearing the hat of a national representative of an EU country, but in general, I think if you talk privately to EU officials, they realize that there are also problems, not only benefits from being the first mover and the standard setter, which is a great success that GDPR received, but you also have to look at the downsides, even for EU companies in that concept. So I think we need to rethink the way we do regulations. We need to work together among the like-minded countries. And I think the access question that you posed for countries that kind of sit on the fence, that might even share our values but feel left out and feel forced to make geopolitical choices they might really not want to make, we need to take that into consideration a lot more.
And I think we are officially out of time. So I know, as I feared, we could go on for another hour, and it's a great conversation, and we're really honored to have such esteemed guests. So thank you again for your time, thank you for sharing, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much.